In a modern building in the heart of the city, the atmosphere was tense that morning, as if the air itself knew something important was about to happen. Claire, the receptionist, occupied her position with almost military rigor. She had always had a certain disdain for those she considered different. This discreet but unwavering attitude was reinforced by years of judgment, prejudices, and unwritten rules that guided his daily life. That morning, she was expecting a visit of the highest importance, that of a client whom she hoped to impress and who, in her eyes, deserved her full attention. However, his meticulously organized plan was quickly disrupted by a man who entered without an appointment, an unusual occurrence in this building where every movement seemed calculated. He was dressed simply, but his sober, perfectly tailored suit betrayed a quality that Claire could not ignore. He seemed calm and reserved, but something in his eyes captivated attention. He said nothing, but his presence commanded tacit respect. It was like an invisible aura floating around him, a subtle blend of mystery and dignity. Claire, although professional, couldn't help but feel unsettled. "I'm here to meet the director," he said in a calm, confident voice, without a hint of hesitation. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Claire hadn't expected to receive so early in the day. Claire scanned him from head to toe, a sarcastic pout on her lips, a slight smirk that reflected her skepticism. Her clothes were impeccable, sure, but nothing about her appearance matched her image of an executive. No ostentatious watch, no collar dripping with prestige, nothing that marks an obvious belonging to this world that she thought she knew. The man seemed both too simple and strangely out of place. He didn't match the criteria she had set up in her mind to qualify a person worthy of her attention. "Do you have an appointment?" Claire asked in a dry tone, as if to put him in his place. The question, although courteous, was also a form of challenge. She was waiting for an answer, a justification, a sign that would prove that this man had a place in this building. The man, without flinching, handed him a business card, a precise and calm gesture. "I am Jean-Paul Lefebvre, owner of this company," he said, as if that would end the entire conversation. His voice was calm, but his gaze did not leave Claire's. He waited, without hurrying, but Claire seemed unsettled, hesitant. She scrutinized the map, perhaps looking for an indication that would allow her to confirm what he had just said. But nothing in her reaction showed that she took him seriously. A short moment of silence followed, heavy, almost palpable, before Claire suddenly turned towards the head of security, Maxime, an imposing man whose massive silhouette loomed in the doorway. Maxime, whose presence was often enough to restore order to complex situations, approached with a firm step. With an authoritative gesture, he invited the stranger to follow him, as if to signify that the matter was now in the hands of someone else. But Claire's uncertainty remained. Why did this man not seem to fit the image she had of big bosses? In the lobby, Claire and Maxime stood near the elevator, listening to the businessman calmly explain his identity. Claire, however, could not get rid of her judgment. She had always been convinced that appearances were often telling, that people carried visible clues to their status or role in society. This man, although he holds an impeccable business card and seems confident, did not seem at home among the leaders of a successful company. He didn't look like he belonged in this world. His manners were too simple, his gaze too penetrating, as if he were trying to reveal a secret. Nothing he said erased the feeling of unease that was growing inside her. She tried not to show her annoyance, but her mind was consumed with conflicting thoughts. She wondered if she was making an error in judgment, but a little inner voice whispered to her that she was right to be wary. People like this man couldn't just appear unannounced in such an important building and claim to be the owners. While listening to his words, she couldn't help but wonder what made him so mysterious. The heavy silence that followed their conversation was suddenly broken by a sharp noise. A clicking sound, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on the polished hall floor. The elevator door opened suddenly, and all eyes turned towards the entrance. An imposing-looking man in a suit entered the hall. It was Arthur Morel, general director of the company. His straight posture and determined look, accompanied by a quick and confident step, gave the moment a new dimension. Claire sat up, her heart beating faster. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would emerge. But as Arthur got closer, the atmosphere changed. The impression of certainty that she had maintained until then was wavering. He stopped in front of the group, his eyes moving from Claire to Jean-Paul with an expression of obvious distrust. "What's going on here?" he asked in a firm, almost authoritarian voice. His gaze scanned the two individuals, a glimmer of incomprehension passing briefly across his face. Maxime, visibly taken by surprise, was about to respond when another noise interrupted the scene. The man in question, Jean-Paul Lefebvre, intervened in a calm but firm tone, as if he had anticipated the situation. "I think I should be the one to question, Arthur." He then turned towards Claire and Maxime, a slight smile, almost amused. "If you had listened to me instead of judging, you would have understood." The change in atmosphere was palpable. Claire felt her face become slightly paler. His hasty judgments collapsed under the weight of this man's quiet confidence. Jean-Paul continued, his voice measured and calm, but filled with undeniable authority. "I am who I said I was. Jean-Paul Lefebvre. And everything you just saw was just an echo of your own prejudices." Arthur, now visibly destabilized, exchanged a furtive glance with Maxime, looking for support. But the latter didn't know what to think. He himself had been surprised by the aura of the stranger, but he could not admit a mistake in front of his superior. Jean-Paul turned to Claire again, his eyes piercing the surface of her professional mask. "I'm not who you thought, and that's the whole point of what you see." He paused, as if to let his words settle in the air before adding, "It's time to get to the bottom of this." The atmosphere changed immediately, becoming heavier, more tense. Claire, who was still about to respond, froze. The feeling she had of having control of the situation vanished in an instant. She observed Jean-Paul without understanding, trying to read his face, but she couldn't. Her thoughts swirled as she wondered how she could have underestimated this man. Meanwhile, Arthur took a step forward, his gaze fixing on Jean-Paul with a new intensity. "Jean-Paul Lefebvre," Arthur murmured, his voice full of a mixture of concern and respect. He suddenly seemed more human, more vulnerable, as if this name, spoken aloud, had the power to change the rules of the game. "I know you. Why didn't you inform me of your arrival?" Jean-Paul smiles gently, a smile imbued with wisdom and calm. He adjusted his tie with a precise gesture, as if to mark the importance of the moment. "I wanted to see for myself what was going on here, Arthur. And, apparently, things are not as harmonious as they should be." His words were chosen carefully, and Claire felt the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a visit. There was something much deeper, a silent test that left barely room for error. Arthur, taken by surprise, suddenly turned towards Claire and Maxime. His gaze, which had previously carried a form of authority, now became icy, almost accusatory. "You heard what he said. Jean-Paul Lefebvre, majority owner of the company. He is not here for a simple visit. You have done wrong." The harshness of his words hit Claire like a punch. Arthur's cold gaze was now fixed on her, and she suddenly felt reduced to the state of a simple employee, caught in the act of hasty judgment. Claire, now on the defensive, tried to justify her actions. But it seemed she hesitated, suddenly realizing that her words rang hollow. There was nothing to say. She had acted on simple prejudice, and everyone, including herself, knew it. Maxime, who until then had remained silent, lowered his head, unable to respond. His shoulders sagged under the weight of recognition of a mistake he could not deny. Jean-Paul slowly turned his head towards Claire, his penetrating eyes searching her soul as if to reveal what she had tried to hide. "Your job is not to judge people by their appearance, but to give them the respect they deserve, regardless of their appearance." The words rang through the air, heavy with truth. Claire suddenly felt small, embarrassed, her face burning with an embarrassment she couldn't hide. A thought crossed her mind, disturbing and almost devastating. How many times had she let her prejudices affect her decisions, her interactions, and her view of others? How many times had she neglected to see the human being behind the appearance? Maxime knew that it was not only an error of judgment, but a moral failure. His actions were not just a reflection of a lack of discernment, but of a deeply ingrained, almost instinctive mentality that he now had to deconstruct. I'm sorry, Monsieur Lefebvre. I was just thinking, he began, his voice full of confusion and regret. His words were lost in the air, unable to repair what was already done. Jean-Paul slowly raised his hand, a firm but non-threatening gesture, to interrupt him. No, Maxime, you didn't think so. You acted on impulse, as you always have. This is the type of behavior that has no place in this company. His words were sharp, but not without a certain amount of disappointment. Claire felt the effect of this reprimand, although it was addressed to Maxime. The company they served was not just a workplace, but a space where respect and reflection should come first. Hasty decisions and superficial judgments had no place here, and Jean-Paul was there to make that clear. The heavy silence that followed the reprimand was almost suffocating, everyone present seeming to be lost in their thoughts. Claire, still frozen, didn't know how to react. Maxime, for his part, looked like a defeated man, trapped by his own errors. But it was Arthur who broke the silence, taking a deep breath, as if preparing to utter words loaded with meaning, words that would mark a turning point. Claire, Maxime, I'm going to make sure that this incident is a turning point for us, he said, his voice serious and determined. A successful business is a business where everyone respects each other. These words, although simple, carried such truth that they struck Claire as a revelation. Arthur, in his role as director, seemed to have taken stock of the situation, and he was determined to change things. His eyes rested on each of them, and his gaze suggested that there would be no room for errors of judgment in the future. Jean-Paul nodded, a slight smile, as if Arthur's answer fully satisfied him. That's what I wish too, Arthur. I built this company on solid principles. Today, I see that there is still work to be done. His words were full of wisdom, and his calm brought a form of serenity to the tense atmosphere. He had not come here to punish, but to show the way for change. His gaze briefly turned towards Claire and Maxime, as if to tell them that the road ahead would be long, but necessary. Later that day, after Jean-Paul had left the premises, Arthur went to his office and sent an email to all employees, a message that would mark the start of a new era for the company. In this email, he announced a series of concrete measures to combat prejudice and promote inclusion within society. Every employee was now required to complete training on the values of respect and equality, and to participate in workshops on diversity and inclusion. This message, much more than a simple announcement, was a manifesto for radical change. It was time to turn the page, leave discriminatory behavior behind, and start building an environment where every individual, regardless of their background, could feel respected. Claire and Maxime, for their part, received detailed instructions concerning the new policies to follow. Although they were suspended for their conduct, they were not left behind. The company offered them the opportunity to redeem themselves, understand their mistakes, and actively participate in this transformation process. Claire, deeply affected by this turn of events, found herself immersed in intense reflection on her own attitudes and how she had acted on instinct rather than discernment. She now knew that she would not only have to change her behaviors, but also her deep beliefs. Maxime, for his part, was aware that he had lost more than his job during this incident. He had lost some of his own respect, and the lesson was hard to accept. But he also knew that this was not the end of his career. It was an opportunity to grow, to become someone better. He promised himself to question himself, to work on himself, so as to never repeat the same mistakes. As the weeks passed, the business began to make a new start. The glass walls that seemed to demarcate the invisible boundaries between individuals gradually shattered. New mentoring programs were introduced, promoting greater diversity in leadership positions. Employees were invited to share their stories, their journeys, in a more open and inclusive setting. Mutual respect and recognition of differences became fundamental values. The company transformed itself into a model of inclusion, embodying the ideals that Jean-Paul Lefebvre had always defended, and this was felt at every level, from management to employees. Claire, through her mistakes, began to understand the importance of empathy, and her outlook on others gradually changed. She tried to understand that each individual deserves to be judged for who they are and not for what they appear to be. She actively sought to educate herself, to go beyond stereotypes and hasty judgments. Maxime, for his part, began to take initiatives to encourage a more respectful culture in his department. Together, they worked to rebuild a relationship of trust, to re-establish their place in a company in full transformation. Thus, the company, through the efforts of its employees and under the attentive leadership of Jean-Paul Lefebvre, became a model of diversity and inclusion. What began as a simple incident of judgment transformed into a collective lesson, an opportunity to grow together, to learn from mistakes, and to commit to a more respectful and humane future.